But we are going to launch this next session. It's around the Acmg Amp Guidelines and the work going on behind the scenes to update those guidelines, which is led by Stephen Harrison and Les Biesecker. Les is on vacation right now, but is joining us in transit. So mostly Stephen's going to be leading the session, but Les will be available for the Q&A and to participate. So I'm going to turn it over to Stephen to kick it off.
Perfect. Thank you. All right. Hopefully you can see my slides, the slide deck here. So I'm Stephen Harrison. I'll be presenting again on behalf of myself and Les Biesecker and the Acmg Interpreting Sequence Variants work group to kind of discuss our processes. Now we're updating the Acmg guidelines and use this as an opportunity to get feedback from the community as we think through some of the decisions that would impact the next iteration. So the current guideline is the 2015 guideline that was a joint recommendation from Acmg and AMP that established this framework for being able to weight different pieces of evidence and then combine those relative weights to get to a classification. And again, this is the current framework, which came out in 2015. In a survey that we had done of laboratories back in 2019, we were able to see that thankfully that this last version of the guideline has been pretty widely adapted. About 95% of surveyed laboratories reported that they were using this guideline, which is great news, as the reason to be able to put these out is so that laboratories will use these in their interpretation processes. However, we in addition, during this polling asked, in what way to use the guidelines? Do you use the guidelines exactly as they're written, or in a way that is consistent but still has some changes to the current framework, or even a more advanced version of the framework? And you can see that even between US and international labs, the vast majority are either using an approach they would consider overall consistent or a more advanced version. And so this shows that there is additional improvements or specifications of the guidelines that could be done in order to have more consistency and harmonization between how laboratories are using the guidelines. So in 2019, Acmg formed a committee to start the next iteration of the guidelines. So this again will be a joint guideline with Acmg and AMP, but now this next iteration will also have ClinGen as a joint partner in this recommendation, similar to the CMV guidelines where it was an Acmg and ClinGen joint recommendation. So the goals for this next version of the guidelines are to revise the current 2015 one to address some of the ambiguities so that there's a lot of labs that have kind of made the same adjustments to the guidelines to kind of incorporate those into the next version for more consistency. As well as to develop a plan for more ongoing updates to the process, because right now we're at over 5-6 years since the last version, to have more incremental sort of updates through to the guidelines. Also to consider moving to a point-based system. This is something the CMV group had already done with their last version, and which I'll explain a bit more in the slides today, that moving to a point version would have a lot of pros with regards to how we can think about variant interpretation. And then also to look at updates from the sequence variant interpretation work group to be able to incorporate some of those edits. So speaking of the point-based system, some of the background for where we're going comes from work that Sean Tibet-Tejan had led in 2018 of taking the current guideline and putting it through a Bayes classifier. So essentially what he was able to do was look at the different probability thresholds of the classification terms, like pathogenic being at 99%, likely pathogenic at 90%, and then look at the combining rules in Richards et al. And work backwards to determine what is the relative odds of pathogenicity at each of the strength levels. And so one of the advantages of this approach is it allows you to fine-tune your evidence types to determine which strength level it really belongs in. For example, is absence, PM2, really at a 4.3 odds of pathogenicity? This also would help as you want to refine, for example, an in silico tool. That if you look at it, it should get to a 2-to-1 odds of pathogenicity. This then Bayesian approach kind of helps you determine which bucket to fall in. But the difficulty then lies in now when you have all these different pieces of evidence, how do you combine them all in a more of a easier manner as opposed to a Bayesian approach. So then trying to work through a process of actually now assigning a point value. So when behind the scenes, each strength level has this odds of pathogenicity, but when it comes time to combining rules, we have this point-based system where, for example, supporting, moderate, strong, very strong are 1, 2, 4, and 8 points. And then down below, you can see the thresholds for the different classification levels, like likely pathogenic being 6 to 9 points, pathogenic above 10. So again, this helps when this process is helping us as we now move to the next version of the guidelines and want to move to more of a point-based system to think about what the sort of current points would be from how the 2015 guideline is set up and be able to use those as a starting place as we again move to now fully moving to a point-based system. So some of the advantage of moving to this point system would be for variants that have conflicting evidence, as right now the 2015 guideline, people can kind of interpret the conflicting evidence portion differently. So with like a point-based approach, if you had this strong and 3 moderate pieces of evidence, you'd be at 10 points. Adding in a benign supporting piece of evidence would just be a -1, would move you down to a likely pathogenic. Whereas if you also added in benign strong to this scenario, you'd be moving into the uncertain significance. So it sort of lets you gauge how much conflicting evidence actually does move you into an uncertain significance classification versus would stay on a pathogenic or likely pathogenic side. This point approach would also allow for criteria combinations that were not specifically called out in the 2015 guideline. For example, a very strong piece of evidence and a supporting piece of evidence would get you to 9 points, which is in the likely pathogenic realm. This combination was not listed in the guideline, but this would be a combination that still fits with this point approach. And now another interesting advantage moving to the point system would be the ability to subdivide VUS categories. So what I'm showing here in this graph that Les had made now has the posterior probability for each classification level in addition to the point values. So VUS ranges from 0.1 to 0.9 probability of pathogenicity, which also correlates to points of 0 through 5. So this whole range would be VUS. Likely pathogenic is between 0.9 and 0.99, which also are points of 6, 7, 8, or 9. Pathogenic above 99 or 10 points. And then similar on the likely benign and benign side, between 0.1 and 0.01 for likely benign being 0.1 and lower. So here I'm just putting the points and the probability of pathogenicity all in the same graph to be able to look at the different scenarios here. So as I mentioned, VUS is a very wide category, going from 0.1 up to a 0.9 probability of pathogenicity. And so you can get many different types of VUSs that fall in this category. For example, if you had a variant that only had the in silico predictors suggesting pathogenicity, that's 1 point for supporting, and you would be here just at a VUS, but at a 0.2 probability of pathogenicity. Whereas in another scenario, if you had a variant that had the tool suggesting damaging, it was in a functional domain, found in trans with a pathogenic variant, this is still an uncertain significance variant, but this would now be at 5 points, which is just above a 0.8 probability of pathogenicity. So both these variants would be classified as VUS, but they're on very different realms as far as how likely it is to actually cause disease. And this made us think that there may be some advantage to subcategorizing VUS to better call out those VUSs that are borderline one way or the other. So the first question we have today, and I forgot to mention, I have a bunch of polls throughout this process, so to poll the audience to be able to get your feedback. And the first question we're going to ask, just as a bit of background here, is again, what is the right approach for these subcategories? So we have an option of having the ACMG workgroup actually define these VUS subcategories, meaning we would define the thresholds, how many points and what the probability would be for each VUS subcategory, as well as suggesting terminology for these. However, these subcategories still would just be optional for labs. We're still keeping the 5-tier system, path, likely path, VUS, likely benign, benign. These would just be additional qualifiers you could add to a VUS variant. The other option here would be do we just let labs decide their thresholds and terminology on their own? So each lab could decide, what boundaries they want to use for a VUS that's on the high side of likely pathogenic, and decide what threshold they'd want to use, as well as what terminology they'd want to use. So we'll move to our very first poll here. So for these pollings, so there's going to be multiples of these. You can either, with your phone, scan the image here to get brought up to a poll, or if you just go to pollev, pollev.com/ClinGen, will take you to the polls as well. Give it a minute here for people to be able to navigate to those. All right, hopefully people are getting there. So pollev.com/ClinGen, or scan the, what it's called here. Right. So hopefully this is now launched for this first question of your preference for the VUS categories, of allowing labs to just subcategorize on their own, so they could each do it a little bit differently, or have the ACMG work group actually recommend our VUS subcategories. Oh, perfect, that's working. You can see there's now 40-ish plus people. We'll wait. How many people are actually on? Okay, we'll wait a bit more here and let some more people answer. I'm hiding the responses yet, so we don't get sort of biased responses. It's still ticking out. All right, give it 30 more seconds here. And there are multiple, I'll have other polls. So if you're missing this first one, you can still navigate to the website, to the poll everywhere, because there'll be additional questions I'll be asking later. All right, looks like it has died down. So I'm going to show the responses now. Okay, it's good news that the majority are in favor of the ACMG work group actually recommending these subcategories and where, what thresholds to use and what terminology would be applicable. Perfect. All right. So in order to now figure out what types of subcategories we should use, I took sort of a test set of VUS variants, which are, I looked at all the variants that are currently classified by the ClinGen expert panels that are in ClinVar, or the evidence repository, and looked only at ones currently classified as uncertain significance, and then looked at what criteria was applied and converted those to the point approach. So we ended up with 397 variants of uncertain significance in the 0 to 5 point range, which again is, with the point approach, is what the VUS category would be. So I'm not saying these necessarily represent what a typical lab would be seeing with regards to the span of VUS, but we just wanted some kind of numbers in here as we play with different subcategories to see where variants would be falling and how common certain scenarios would be. So again, we're going to look at this scale here with the probability and then the both the points and the posterior probability of the different categories specifically here for VUS. So our next question is now, if we want to pursue these subcategories, what's the right approach to sort of dividing VUS into these subcategories? So we have three options, which I'll go through these three, and then we'll do another poll. So the first option would be to split VUS right in the middle. So we'd have a VUS high category, which is 0.5 up to 0.9, or points of 3, 4, or 5. And then a VUS low, which is from 0.5 down to 0.1, which is the boundary for likely benign, and would be the points of 0, 1, or 2. So this is option number one, a VUS high and low, just split in the middle. Alternatively, we could also split it into two categories, but have the just a VUS high, which would sort of raise the bar to kind of only just the top tier of VUSs, and then anything below it would just be a VUS not high. I'm making up terms here, but just for the different scenarios. So this is option two, also splitting VUS in two, but just a VUS high category, and then anything that's not high below. So more of a 1/3 and 2/3 as opposed to the other one that was a 50-50 split. And then the last option would be to actually split VUS into three categories, a high, mid, and low. where it'd be high 4 and 5 points, mid 2 to 3, low 0 to 1. So somewhat equal here distribution within the US for 3 separate categories. All right, so now we will try polling here again to see what people's just preferred approach would be for these subcategories of doing, again, the 2, that is a 50-50 split, 2 categories where it's more of a 1/3, 2/3 split, and then the 3 categories, a high, mid, or low.
And Stephen, while the results are coming in, somebody asked, to understand the robustness of these polls, could you tell us how many people are voting? So I will point out at the bottom corner of Stephen's slide, you'll see the total results number is coming in. So that's where you'll see that. And this may be relevant to when you get to the section on terminology, but there is also another question around, are you aware of VUS thresholds declared by ACGS, that's a UK group, hot VUS, tepid VUS, and their suggestion to only includes uncertain variants that reach at least the warm VUS category in a medical report. If yes, what is your opinion on that?
Yeah, it's a good question. That I am familiar. I think they're doing a similar point approach. As far as necessarily recommending that only the higher ones get reported, I think that would be more up to each laboratory as far as what was tested, when they would only want to report that high VUS category versus all, that I'm not sure if we would necessarily recommend that in the guidelines, if you and Les and Heidi, you both agree.
It's a good question, and it's probably a topic that an ACMG work group should take up. Whether it's the ISV one or it's another one is probably something we should discuss.
All right, let's see our responses now here. All right, so it looks like preference overall was the 3 category, high, mid, low, but not too far off. It was the 2 categories where it's not an even split, more just calling out the high and then anything not high. Which interestingly is actually pretty similar. When we did this internally with just our ACMG work group, we kind of had the same scenario where overall the people were more in favor of the 3, but we did have quite a few that also preferred this approach of the high and not high. So that's interesting to see. All right, so then our next question gets into what would be the preferred terminology for these different subcategories. So I've just been calling them high, mid, low here, which I'll actually add in as options. But we wanted to see what people's just sort of gut instinct was about what terms would be preferred for these scenarios. So what I'm going to do here is, instead of multiple choice, the poll everywhere is going to change to a ranking system. So we're going to rank for people's preferences for the VUS high and low. And then I'm going to discuss the input we've had from the ACMG work group about why we liked or disliked some, and then repoll again and compare the responses to see if options change here. And one thing I wanted to call out, so when you open the poll for this ranking, I used the term VUS instead of uncertain significance because some of the text descriptions were getting long, and if you're on your phone, you wouldn't be able to see the entire language. So this is just for the ease of being able to see it all on your screen. We would actually say uncertain significance, not VUS in the official terminology. And so this is going to be a rank. I also wanted to point out, so when this comes up on your screen, in order to move the options you like to the top and ones you don't like to the bottom, you first have to click on each term and then arrows will appear and then you can move it up or down. So this will be ranking, not multiple choice, because we want to see kind of the full range here. All right, and then here's just the website and the scanning again, in case people didn't get to it. And now here, so I noticed there are a lot of options here. So I'll leave this one up for a bit as people want to start doing their ranking. Again, click on the option and the arrows will appear. And if it's, if it's getting difficult to try to distinguish between all these, if you just kind of want to move the ones you like to the top and not like to the bottom, you don't have to worry as much about the middle. categories here. We'll stay on this one for a bit because I know it's going to take a little bit longer for people to fill out this one. And again, I will re-pull for these same options after we have a little bit of discussion about the terms.
And you may want to do a screenshot of what you landed on so that if you decide you don't change your mind, you have it all set up.
That's true. You can just go back to the same
in the document, and then you can remember what you came up with, or change it if you changed your mind since then. As I sit here and move them around myself.
And I think this one is easier. I should have mentioned this. Easier to do, I think, on a computer than the phone. These rankings. Additionally, if there's a term you think would be helpful here that you're not seeing listed, you could also put that gets into the chat or the Q&A, and we can put that into kind of additional list that the work group could consider. Oh, and I see someone did ask what would be the terminology for the middle area. So because of just timing today, I was going to start with the high because the high falls into all three scenarios we talked about. And then the low, because I wasn't sure how people would respond to the first question of if they preferred 2 or 3. So I left off the mid for now, but that would be another discussion to have of, if we decide 3 categories is the right way to go, what is the term to put on the mid or middle category of the US?
So someone asked, not sure what we are doing here. So just to reiterate what Stephen said, we're on the poll, pollev.com/ClinGen, and you're moving up and ranking what terms you prefer, your favorite at the top, your least favorite at the bottom. And you can mix around the middle to the extent that you have the tolerance to move everything around. I don't know if that answers the question. Hopefully everybody knows what we're doing. And 55 results are in, so
I think
55
okay,
of you do.
We'll move on to now looking at the low. All right, so you see it's a lot of the same terms, but now benign, likely benign, but put in as opposed to path, likely path.
And while people are answering this round, there are a couple questions that came in the chat. One was, what about splitting VUS? I think only the panelists can see this, but what about splitting VUS based on case level data? So it's like, instead of just points, what if you were to think about it based on what the evidence behind those points were? I'll let you respond.
So I think, once we start, so we are working on different matrices and decision trees for moving to the next version of the guidelines. And I think that will be an important thing to consider is as we start thinking of these different ranges to then go back and look at what are all the scenarios that would land you in these buckets, just to kind of make sure it all works out, that it is the kind of scenarios that people would be thinking of in that top category of, especially the VUS high, that it's, that I think, maybe if you want some kind of clinical evidence or something added in there, that's, we'll have to kind of play around with the different decision trees there.
And one other question, were VUS in different types of genes, enzymes, transmembrane, structural genes used for this analysis, and would results differ from genes encoding different types of products?
So some of that information could, again, go into the assessment about, if a gene is, sort of like the current rule about the missense constrained, or like that if it's in a certain domain or, functional part of the gene that, that is points that might push it into a, higher category versus in a gene where you don't know as much about it, you're not going to have those additional points to add in. So it would end up on kind of the other side.
Yeah, and Kristen made a comment, once this tiered VOS category is implemented, it would be helpful for clinical labs to include a list of the types of evidence that they need in order to reclassify to likely pathogenic. Yeah, this is complex, but it relates to, all we would need is 2 segregations in a family member to apply this evidence, and it would be reclassified as likely, something that might be a very practical guidance, for example.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think that was sort of what at least with the ACGS group, that's what they were trying to specifically call out with their high category, is that these are variants that could be reclassified with additional evidence. But I guess it is kind of going that next step further of what is that evidence we would need to push it. But I guess it comes down to whether it's the lab lists what evidence went into that classification, so you're able to tell what they didn't have that then they would need, versus the lab actually calling out specifically, we need this or this in order to reclassify.
Yep.
All right, let's say we got a good amount of response here. So I'm not going to show these results yet because we're going to now talk about our rationale for why we liked or disliked some, and then repoll, and then I'll show the comparison after that. All right. So looking again at the different categories here, you can see there is we tried doing symmetry between the high and low side with regards to the terms we would use. So when we were discussing these within the ACMG working group, one of the issues that had come up that there was some concern that just using the term pathogenic in this VUS high category could lead to misinterpretation of, if, a clinician is just looking at the report and sees the word pathogenic in that classification term, that they may think we're trying to say that it is actually a pathogenic variant. So we had then thought about trying to use a different term, such as the suspicious or high, as opposed to actually using the word pathogenic. The issue we had, at least with these two options, of the suspicious or high, is that there's still not much clarity about what we're trying to say. For example, with suspicious, there were concerns that it could be construed that we are suspicious that the variant isn't real, that it could be like we're trying to say it's a potential false positive or something. Even with the term VUS high, there was a concern that it could be construed as it is highly uncertain, like it is very, very uncertain significance variant, as opposed to it really being clear that what we mean is on the point scale of VUS, it is high, getting close to that likely pathogenic side. So we decided maybe those other kind of words aren't a great match. And then as we were thinking more again about what the right phrasing here would be, we also realized that using a descriptor plus just the word pathogenic, it skips over the likely pathogenic realm, then it makes it sound like we are borderline pathogenic, but really if you're on that upper range of VUS, you're borderline likely pathogenic, not pathogenic. And so we thought that, for these different phrasings where we're saying, favor, leaning, instead of saying pathogenic, perhaps likely pathogenic, would be helpful here and may help downplay some of the confusion that could come up when people are looking at these, trying to think that we're actually trying to say these are likely pathogenic, as opposed to getting onto the cusp of going into likely pathogenic. All right. And then we had similar issues on the benign side about using the words benign or likely benign, and that just using descriptor plus benign would skip over the likely benign side. And then we also thought that at least the high seems to be the more interesting category, so it would also make sense to kind of have that same structure on the low side of using the same verbiage. So if it is leaning is the right word to use, we then want to use it on the pathogenic side and benign side. So again, yeah, we kind of figured these suspicious and high-low ones may be confusing, that we thought perhaps using just the likely path or likely benign term in the VUS subcategory could be the right option to go. So now do the repolling here of highs and lows just to see if people's opinions changed. We'll go a little bit quicker here because I think we only have about 10 minutes left, right, Heidi? I think that's right for the timing.
Correct. We only have till, well, 1:10 technically to have a 5-minute break, but we needed to go over a
All right,
little
so
bit.
yeah, they just have these, so we'll leave this up for a minute and then.
No, sorry, 1:15. We can go to 1:15. There are some questions that have been coming in. I'm trying to answer some of them. But for the low range, is minus 1.1 BP code going to be VUS or likely benign? In the current framework, 0 point is usually no evidence, but 1 BP code VUS will be likely to become LB in the future.
Yes, so that is a complicating factor that we were discussing in the ACMG work group as well, that one of the issues on the low side is it does depend on if we move to where a single benign supporting piece of evidence moves you to likely benign, because with the point or Bayesian approach, it does, but with the 2015 guideline as written, those variants would be the US. And so that is something that we're kind of struggling with, because if we, I think of the current benign supporting rules, I think there are some that laboratories would be comfortable with just that on its own, getting you to likely benign. And I think there are certain ones where they wouldn't be comfortable, that they would err on the conservative side of still calling those VUS. So it is a great question, and that's something that we've been struggling with as well, of the right threshold for, or points on the VUS to likely benign side.
Also, how could we differentiate VUS with less points because they are leaning to benign, have codes that are met, versus VUS with less points because there is little or no evidence for the variant?
So I think that would be clearer in the points, because if there's nothing added, you're just at a zero. Yes.
Right.
Whereas if there, were points being added in either direction, then you'd be able to see that with the, whatever the point
right.
spot is.
And a question that came into the chat box is around whether you would be providing the points or percentages, in this case points, as well as the terms.
So that was something we also discussed internally, and there was a question from LAMS about how easy it would be to get that number in the actual term. And so maybe something that they can put into the text descriptor of how they classified the variant, of being able to put the number in there, as opposed to in the actual classification term itself.
And there was a question of whether we consider the word trending. I think that was in our list.
So that was one. And then because I had so many options here, I ended up taking out trending, because we didn't have as many. I was worried that it sounded a little like social media-y to use the word trending, that I didn't include that one, but that is an option that I guess we could consider as well. All right, so it's been like a few minutes here. I want to make sure we get to being able to do the comparisons here. So I'm going to move now to just re-ranking the VUS low side.
And Claire Turnbull did make some clarifications around the hot VUS, cold, lukewarm, tepid sort of framework. So if people are curious, I encourage you to open the Q&A and see Claire's comments in there that help clarify that.
And I see Jonathan also had a comment about the exact percentage or likelihood, which was another point we had discussed internally, that if we try to move it to not a point, but actually saying like what your probability is on the scale, that could lead to an over interpretation of how precise we really are in the classification, of like the difference between 70% probability and a 75% probability. That is for so many of the data types we look at, there isn't that necessarily quantitative part. And so it could make it seem like we have more precision in our classifications than we necessarily do.
Right. I agree. And I think the points is a little better than percentages. Percentages make you feel like it's a real derived percentage, whereas points say, well, I applied some points, because that's the system, but maybe less exactness.
Yeah. All right, just another few seconds here. So I know there's a lot of options. I wanted to include as many as we could, but I think it's It would take a while to rank these. Maybe slow down here. All right, so now we'll go actually compare, now that we've done both, compare what we had from the first round and second rounds. Hopefully I set up these polls right, that now we can do this. So from the first round, oh, sorry, let me go back, I did it. Oh wait, this was right, sorry. Show responses. So from the first round of the VUS highs, looks like the preference was approaching, likely pathogenic, then leaning. So overall, looks like even before we talked about it, people's preference was including the likely pathogenic as opposed to pathogenic. And these other types of terms were not so preferred. That actually, that's interesting that that's what people got to before we even discussed it. So that's helpful to see. And so, okay, so it looks like approaching was the top answer on the first round. And from the second one, interesting, leaning then moved ahead. I'll have to look at what the numbers were between these to see how far off, but it looks like the leaning pathogenic became the favorite after the second round over approaching, but still kind of the ones that people disliked at the bottom, and overall the likely pathogenic phrasing was the preferred term. So that's good to see. And from on the benign side, or the low side, approaching likely benign, so mirroring what we did on the other side, and the other terms being kind of at the bottom here. And after round two, see if I can get this to go. Interesting, this one also flipped to leaning over approaching between the first two rounds. That's good to know. All right, but yeah, I'll have to look at what the numbers were that I forgot to add in an option to actually see how many people voted for each one of these to see what the difference between first and seconds were. But that's good that actually it's nice that what we had come to within our ACMG work group actually mirrored what people in the community were thinking, because we had thought that approaching likely pathogenic, likely benign was the way to go. But it sounds like we should also still think about leaning and think of that as another option.
And we should put in the ACGS terms as well, the hot and cold and tepid and lukewarm.
The hot, cold, tepid. Yeah, that's a good idea. I did the high, but I didn't think to do hot instead, but that's a good idea. Perfect. All right, well, thank you everyone for your input today. We're hoping on having a few more of these over the next year to get feedback for some of the other parts that we're working on, like some of the decision trees and matrices, because as we move to more of a point-based system, we thought that decision trees is the right format to go, as opposed to the current grid where you pull out the different types. So we'll hopefully have more opportunities for feedback from people in the future. I just wanted to thank our working group on the 2019 Interpreting Sequence Variants Work Group. The year is from the year we were formed, obviously, not the year that the guidance came out, because we are past that now. And then also the SVI working group that have done a lot of the additional specifications that now we can incorporate into the group, as well as all the different expert panels in ClinGen, because it's a lot of the experiences that the expert panels have come across that informs sort of some of these additional specifications and changes that we'd want to make to the next iteration of the guidelines. So I wanted to thank all the people who work on these to actually make it possible.
Right. And there is one last question that came in from Claire, or question/comment. There's the danger of forgetting that Sean's Bayesian framework and subsequent point system is predicated on a prior probability of pathogenicity of 10%. When analyzing in context of large tests or exome genome and minimal phenotype, then the prior is lower. Secondary findings in 59 genes, for example, then the variant score classification is specific to context, keeps coming up in UK discussions, maybe should not make LP actionable only P, but very complex message then.
Yeah, and it is, so and one of the reasons that in the Bayesian approach that the prior starts at 0.1 is in the 2015 guideline, if you had no evidence, you're out of the US. And so we had to start as the lowest you could get, but still be at the US with no evidence, because we weren't sure the comfortability labs would have of just calling everything likely benign with no evidence. And so it's kind of gets into this tricky thing that yes, the prior probabilities, most of those are going to end up being likely benign, but to have them all start there without actually assessing it, we weren't sure the comfortability people would have with that kind of approach.
And I see Les came off of mute. He might want to weigh in here. Les, are you online.
Yeah. I think that's a great question, but it does raise the concern that you don't want to confuse the pathogenicity of a variant with the determination, the likelihood of the determination of the patient, i.e. the result of the interpretation by the clinician. So we do not want variants to have different pathogenicities just because they were ascertained in a different setting, diagnostic versus screening. They have different implications for patients, those testing settings for sure, but the variants are the same. So we need to think critically about how we separate those factors out and think about them clearly.
Exactly, I 100% agree with Les. We can't change pathogenicity based on the context. However, because you can count case level data as part of your aggregate evidence, then you can separately use the patient you're testing in the case level data, and that should be how context influences pathogenicity, but not by changing the prior for every pathogenicity assessment. So hopefully we can really work to distinguish, the case in front of you as part of the aggregate case level evidence and not changing your priors. All right. Thank you, Stephen, for that excellent session. Thanks for weighing in, Les, and joining us on your vacation. It's clear we could do this for another 5 hours with lots of audience polls, and we will have more workshops. We may have some that are just standalone for this committee to enable engagement. And actually, Les and Stephen are going to do one as associated with ESHG, now moved to the last weekend in August. And then we'll do others in the future. So look for opportunities for all of you to weigh in various surveys and forums. But thank you, Stephen and Les. And I'm going to turn it over. Unfortunately, the ACMG review course is going on simultaneously, and Sharon Plan and I have to jump over to that. So I'm going to turn over moderation to the next session to Alice Popejoy for the ancestry diversity and grant plans topic that will be coming. So take it away, Alice.
Alice, we can't hear you.
Can you see my slides? Can you hear me?
Yep, that's great.
Wonderful, thank you. Okay, well, thank you so much for having me on in the last session of today. I'm going to be talking about our efforts on diversity, equity, and inclusion in ClinGen, give you a broad overview. Then we'll talk about the diversity, equity, and inclusion action plan for ClinGen that we've been working on for a while now, and as well as all of the various plans that each of the grants within ClinGen has for the next phase of funding. And then we are fortunate to have a presentation from the DEI committee from ACMG, and then we'll have a group discussion. So first of all, I wanted to talk to you briefly about the Unite initiative from NIH and their RFI that they recently put out to advance and strengthen racial equity, diversity, and inclusion in the biomedical research workforce and advance health disparities and health equity research. So we went through a process within the steering committee to come up with challenges, recommendations, and metrics of success within ClinGen for different areas that we felt were relevant for the RFI. So those areas were biomedical workforce support and development, policies and partnerships to enhance equity and funding, research on healthcare inequities, and partnerships and support for innovation and data collection for diversity measures. So we submitted this response with listed challenges, recommendations, and metrics of success for each of these areas in response to the Unite RFI. And we also were fortunate to have Vince Bonham from NHGRI present to the steering committee on this RFI in preparation of our discussions and in preparation of this response that we put together. We also have been working in the Ancestry and Diversity Working Group to expand the reach of the discussions that we have and increase transparency with our efforts through the Ancestry and Diversity Forum. So we now have a website up, our webpage of the ClinGen website up for the Ancestry and Diversity Forum. So if you have not been able to join thus far, there's a tab here that says join the forum or get involved. So you can go to this link or just navigate to it through the working group page, and you can sign up for emails, get alerts about our future forum. You can submit nominations or volunteer yourself to present on a future Ancestry and Diversity Forum. And the goal of this is really to coalesce around the evidence and the research that's going on right now to help us inform a process of developing recommendations and guidelines for the use of race, ethnicity, and ancestry in clinical genetics. So we've had guest speakers from all over the country, and other countries as well, talking about these issues. And we have now all of those recordings of our previous forums on individual pages that you can navigate to through clicking on these boxes. There's one for each talk that we've had since 2019. And then you can navigate to the video, or you can either watch it on our site or navigate and watch it on YouTube. So if you go to our ClinGen YouTube channel, we have a playlist of all the previous forum presentations. So you can check those out as well and follow along with kind of what our process is and how have we kind of gone through the different types of research and in order to sort of build an understanding of really what's going on in the field with regard to diversity measures in clinical genetics and genomics. So I'm going to just briefly talk about our action plan for DEI across ClinGen. So far we've presented on steering committee meetings. We've had 3 presentations on the Ancestry and Diversity Forum, as well as meetings of the Ancestry and Diversity Working Group to really go through a robust process of brainstorming and sort of expanding and cutting and really just thinking about what are the things that are really key for us to do within ClinGen moving forward with regard to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So we now have a draft action plan, and this is just an overview of the areas of the action plan. Well, and first, sorry, our audience is meant to be the genomics and clinical genetics community broadly. Our objectives are just to describe what our commitments are and the activities that we're going to do. We want to increase transparency of our diversity efforts, partly through the forum, but in other ways as well. And we want to hold ourselves accountable internally and externally for the objectives that we come out with. So the structure of our action plan currently is an introduction and motivation, our discussion on community engagement, public accountability, and then 3 basic overall domains of DEI that we are aiming towards. So the first is knowledge and tools. Next is standards and guidelines, and the third is workforce diversity. And then we have a timeline of deliverables and references. So in this first one, contributing genomic knowledge and tools to enhance equity in clinical genetics. Specifically, we want to increase diversity in the data we promote through our creation interfaces. We want to enhance accessibility of ClinGen tools and resources. We want to include data on prevalence and allele frequencies across populations. And we're striving for anti-racism in our education and training materials, and we're still under discussion of what that means and what that looks like, and develop structured data streams to characterize diverse populations. The next is developing standards and consensus guidelines for diversity in genomics. So we are working with different professional organizations, other research consortia, and working groups to start to coalesce around some do's and don'ts, best practices, which we hope will sort of translate into recommendations and eventually guidelines in partnership with Acmg and others on the use of race, ethnicity, and ancestry in clinical genomics. So this has involved so far sort of working through definitions of diversity measures, identifying use cases for different frameworks of diversity measures that we've identified, and guidelines for the collection, use, and reporting of diversity data. And finally, one of our goals is to foster a diverse, equitable, and inclusive workforce for genomic medicine, which we know is really important to the NIH, as well as the professional societies. So our goal is to adopt strategies and policies to recruit and retain more diverse participants, both in our working groups and expert panels, as well as on our research teams in our home institutions. We also aim to assist NIH and the professional societies in their efforts to track diversity in the field. So this would include data collection, analysis, and reporting of demographic data on both our internal teams as well as our working groups and expert panels. And that is the overview for all of ClinGen. So briefly, I'm going to present the Stanford Baylor Grant's approach to DEI for the next phase, and then I'll invite other speakers from the 2 other grants to share their screens and tell us about their DEI efforts in their grant proposals, and then we will move to the ACMG DEI committee discussion. But I'm going to pause there just for a moment and ask if there are any questions or comments on the overall ClinGen approach to DEI and what we've been working on. If any PIs want to add anything, if there are questions from the audience, happy to take those now. I think we have some time. I can't see the chat. So if there are any in the chat, someone could let me know.
I don't see any questions in the chat, Alice.
Okay, great. So for the Stanford Baylor grants, there are sort of 3 pillars of what we are thinking about and what we proposed for the 3rd phase of ClinGen. One is data, 2 is standards, 3 is training. So in terms of data, we are really focused on population allele frequencies and getting all of those in that we can from different resources from different populations. Pharmacogenetics, we have Terry Klein coming on as the new Stanford PI. So we'll be able to partner with PharmGKB and really think about what is pharmacogenetics, how can we sort of bring that into our work. We also are looking at multi-omic functional and case segregation data and how do we integrate those into our curation interfaces. As far as standards go, we are working on in the complex disease working group and also with the ancestry and diversity working group, we're thinking about polygenic risk scores, particularly as they apply across populations. We're thinking about data access, protection, and use across different platforms and with different considerations from different communities, and also thinking about curation in diverse and admixed populations when they may not be very well represented in databases, and what does that mean for curation protocols, and how do we sort of adjust when we don't have complete information for certain groups. And finally, in training, we really want to ensure that our curation tools are accessible to people, not just in the US and Europe, but everywhere, and also accessible in terms of different people's needs and in terms of their use. And again, we're also wanting to make sure that people are trained up on the data standards that we come up with, and that there's a wide competency in terms of what our policies are in terms of data access and use across the platform. So our basic aims are number 1, to aggregate diverse genomic and phenotype data to enhance our curation process and empower our user community. We want to implement standards for ClinGen gene and variant curation by hosting workshops and also developing new tools to scale curation and increase automation. We want to implement our standards for actionability curation, establish new standards for curation, and disseminate ClinGen knowledge and evidence to the broader community. So that's what we are working on within the Stanford Baylor grant, and I would invite either the UNC Kaiser or Harvard Broad to share your screen and share with us your slides.
I can go ahead and share. I don't know if I'm the next on the agenda, but I'm happy to do that. Okay, is my presentation showing?
Yeah.
All right. So, so for the UNC Kaiser grant, we had a number of elements built in as far as our diversity action plan for phase 3 of ClinGen. I think the first one is really to pay attention to how we can actually generate information about the workforce that we have, particularly the volunteer curators, but also, you know, everyone that's contributing to expert panels and clinical domain working groups across the consortium. You know, I think we know the count, but we don't have a good sense of demographics and One thing that we'd like to be able to do is develop a consortium-wide personnel management system that would give us an opportunity to start looking at, looking at those aspects of ClinGen, and then, looking for opportunities to improve, and also to see when we have some kind of implementation, whether that's having an effect. So what we'd like to see is that we get some baseline information about the demographics across the consortium, and then ideally set some goals for ourselves over all of us, the entire consortium across the next phase of the project. Some of the specific things UNC, Kaiser, and Georgetown are doing, we each have kind of different forms of engagement for undergraduate students, whether they are intern programs or programs that are attached to, like the CTSA at Georgetown. UNC has a program called Solar that attracts undergraduate students. And our participation in those types of initiatives will hopefully help to encourage some, volunteer biocurators to enter our groups. We also have some outreach and dissemination aims that relate to teaching, training, and recruiting students from underrepresented groups. This is in part an educational component where biocurators from our group can give presentations to genetics courses or other biology courses at some of the local universities and colleges to try to really bring some of the knowledge that we're generating to sort of, liven up the educational process at those places. We also have submitted an R25 Diversity Action Plan grant that will leverage some of our projects like ClinGen to provide some learning experiences and mentorship for undergrads. And again, the goal here is to introduce students to the fields of genetics and genomics and all the various ways that one can enter careers and what those careers might look like and what the training paths are, and talking to people who have undergone those pathways to really increase the pipeline of students that want to go into genetics and genomics. And then I just mentioned that there's a consortium-wide collaboration with H3 Africa that UNC is certainly participating in, but not particularly leading. But I think that will give us lots of opportunities to engage expert panels with genomicists in Africa who are interested in many of the same things we are, and to introduce them to our processes and our expert panels. And then finally, I'll say one of the sort of more researchy projects that we have proposed is to work with the Global Genomic Medicine Collaborative, which is a sort of a translational and implementation science focused group that is really about evidence generation through pilot projects in various parts of the world to try to really implement genomic medicine in various places. They have an evidence working group, which I find interesting, and I think there's a very nice sort of link between the evidence generation that ClinGen does, or at least the evidence evaluation that ClinGen does, that could tie in quite nicely. So we're interested in building up our collaboration with the G2MC, and also the G2MC has a resource called the International 100K Cohorts Consortium, where they have pulled together a number of investigators across the country, across the world, who have various cohorts and with and without phenotypic information. And we are going to have a pilot project between one of our VCEPs and the IHCC to see if we can access data from their consortium in the interest of helping to interpret variants. So those are the various projects that we're working on.
Thanks so much, Jonathan. So let's invite our next speaker from the Harvard Broad.
All right, can you see those slides in presenter mode?
Yep.
Okay, great, thank you. I am Danielle Azzariti, and I'm presenting on behalf of the Broad Geisinger ClinGen grant. And today I'll be summarizing our efforts in two main areas, workforce and then in our curation work. And I will say what's laid out in our workforce slide that I'll be going over next is in collaboration with the other grants, as you've heard, as we all work together as a consortium. So to facilitate learning and collaboration between our consortium members and our colleagues around the world, we'll work with the other groups to coordinate training workshops. We completed a successful collaborative workshop with the H3 Africa Rare Disease Working Group this February, which I think both ourselves as ClinGen and the H3 Africa Working Group thought that was a good model to continue to build these relationships and hold workshops like this in the future. And these opportunities not only serve as training opportunities and ways to disseminate ClinGen's work, but also really valuable opportunities to recruit both experts and curators to join our working groups and expert panels in their areas of expertise. We're also expanding efforts to raise awareness and promote opportunities in clinical genetics, especially with learners at the high school and undergraduate levels. So those efforts include at Broad and Geisinger, like at the other institutions that you heard about, summer internships with a focus on addressing opportunity barriers and working with existing programs that are recruiting students from underrepresented groups in the sciences. And to go along with that, to complement the internships, we are organizing a summer clinical genomics career panel. So all of the interns across our institutions will be invited to that, but we hope that it can serve as an educational resource for anyone in the community looking to share clinical genomics information with young professionals or students. And as we're doing this work, along with the other grants, we do plan to continue and improve how we collect metrics on our workforce and the attendees of our outreach events. And that way we can measure if indeed we are making improvements where we hope to, and if not, reevaluate the approaches that we have in place. And then just briefly, I'll speak about our plans to focus on improving knowledge of genetic variation from underserved and therefore underrepresented populations. We're working with clinical laboratories and other sources of genomic data to ensure that variants observed in underrepresented populations are submitted to ClinVar, are prioritized for evaluation by our expert panels, and can be reliably detected in genetic tests. So one example I'll talk about is a collaboration that we worked on with Invitae, in which they were able to provide us a list of the most common variants among underrepresented groups within the genes and scope of our variant curation expert panels. So our next goal is to now assign these variants to the appropriate VSEPs to ensure that they are prioritized for curation and then of course submitted to ClinVar and those curations made publicly available. And finally, our team has been working closely with both the variant curation expert panels and also the CDC on their genetic testing reference materials coordination program, or GET-RM for short, our project to provide clinical testing laboratories with appropriate reference materials, which laboratories can then use to validate their assays. And as we're creating this pipeline to prioritize variant curation for underrepresented populations, we'll ensure those final curations are included in these GET-RM data sets so that laboratories can make sure technically they're able to detect these important disease-causing variants across populations. And we are hoping to reach out to more clinical labs in the future to work with you to collect variants that you've observed in underrepresented populations. So you're welcome to reach out to us, but we'll probably be reaching out to you in the near future to discuss that. So that concludes the Berg Geisinger update.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Danielle. And sorry, I misspoke. Harvard Broad's the Broad Geisinger grant. So thank you for that. And now I would like to invite our guests from Acmg, Katy, Phelan, and Cinthya Zepeda-Mendoza to present your vision, what you hope to accomplish, and your recommendations for your DEI efforts and our collaboration on the use of race, ethnicity, and ancestry in clinical genetics. And then we'll have a 10 minutes for your presentation and about 5 minutes for discussion. And then we'll have time for discussion and questions at the end about the whole session.
Okay, we want to start out by showing a picture of our diversity committee. So we took great pains to have a committee that reflected various backgrounds and also that reflected various stages in their genetics career and their genetic specialties. So we have people who are clinical geneticists, laboratory geneticists, a genetic counselor, and we have a student who was just accepted to medical school. We have trainees, we have people at the beginning, at the middle, and at the advanced stages of their careers. So we wanted to hear voices from as much as we could in our field of genetics, so we could understand what the people are saying and they value their opinion. And the members of the DEI committee also serve as representatives to other committees in the college. So Cinthya is a rep to the program committee. Another member is a rep to the Summer Scholars Committee. Another person is a member to the Conflict of Interest Committee. So by having this visibility, we're hoping that our members will enhance their leadership skills and their visibility. And over time, this is how you make it to the board of directors, that you serve on committees and you take leadership positions. And my hope is that several years from now, we will see these pictures on our board of directors, which is not very diverse right now. And so I hope that someday this is what our board of directors, yes, we do have one person on our board of directors, and we are equally split on the board between males and females. But as far as many people from diverse backgrounds, we don't have that. So we want people who are passionate about diversity on our committee, and we want people from different backgrounds because we value their input, and we know that they can give us information that I don't have. So that was our hope in designing a committee that looks more diverse than our membership looks, and that they could give us help in accomplishing our goal to increase diversity in our membership. Cinthya, do you have anything to add to that?
I just got to say that it's been a pleasure working at the DEI committee, and as a junior faculty, it's been a tremendous opportunity for growth and getting to know and network with so many more diverse colleagues and just share experiences and grow together.
Okay, the next slide. Okay, so our committees, this is the DEI committee is responsible for facilitating activities where the inherent worth and dignity of people are accepted, recognized, and respected. That's kind of the charter of our committee. And we want to make sure in our publications that we're not fostering unconscious bias or any kind of prejudice against individuals. So we've put that in our proposals, publication proposals, to make sure that people are looking into diversity for their publications. We want to enhance the diversity to our membership, obviously, and at all levels of the college. And we want to have a standard of behavior and accountability, so people are responsible and own their own behavior. And then we want to enhance education at all levels in the college. So that's our goal. Cinthya, do you want to go with this one?
Oh, for sure. So we have a plan of action that we have developed, and it's composed of several different parts. The first part is actually partnering with other genetic organizations and then trying to increase the efforts for increasing the diversity in these different organizations, as well as reaching out to, let's say, underrepresented minorities. So coming back into the ACMG itself, so we are actually addressing DEI principles in ACMG committees, and we are working to ensure that ACMG documents reflect these DEI values. So we have made modifications so that now project proposals actually have a section where the people who propose these projects actually make sure that there is enough diversity and enough differences in opinion before they submit these projects. And then we really want to target the undergraduate and graduate student populations to promote DEI in different educational activities, because we know that as we target them in the earlier stages, then we can actually increase the diversity in our own medical genetics field. And we are also working to increase ACMG's membership diversity there's a lot of perks into, let's say, obtaining like free membership to the college if you are like a trainee, or reduced rates if you are applying from another country to become a member of ACMG.
Student membership is free.
Oh, yes.
It's very important.
It's free. And then finally, we are here to listen and learn from our community. And all of this is basically to diminish those effects of racism in medical genetics that have been quite pervasive since a long time. And so we really want to advance health equity. And we have this initial plan of action that we have started. So in terms of partnership with other organizations, and these are just some examples of that plan of action, we together with ACHG, NHGRI, and NSGC, there's a collaboration to evaluate the US genetics and genomics workforce and strategize to increase the workforce diversity, equity, and inclusion. We have also targeted and participated in annual meetings from two different societies, the SACNAS and ABRCAMS, which are basically societies that promote science in minorities. So we participated in the SACNAS meeting last year. We had a booth together with ASHG as well as with ABRCAMS, and just got to meet with students and tell them about the genetics field in general and what they can do if they're interested in joining medical genetics. So, oh, go ahead, Kathy.
So at
Yes.
our annual meeting, we've had the diversity breakfast and discussion. So people come here and they usually have a short presentation, and then individuals who are members of the college come in, they have a chance to network with other people in the college and promote diversity. And we'd like to be able to have students come to this as well. And then there's a student day, and one day where students come to the annual meeting, whether they're undergraduate, graduate, or counseling students, medical students. And then this year, after our annual meeting, we had a diversity forum. It was a health disparities in genetics forum that had really a wide audience, and was very well received. And I think it's still available on our website. And we have the Summer Scholars Program. One of our DEI members is a representative on that. And in the Next Generation Fellowship, the application for the fellowships now has a question: what has the applicant done to advance diversity? I don't know how exactly the question is asked, but it does ask them about diversity. So we'll have something else kind of to screen the scholarship fellows on. And then we had Diversity Day at the annual meeting. We'll make that an annual event so that we can publish tools or announcements or facts about diversity during a one day at the annual meeting. Cinthya, take it away.
Sure, thank you. And so finally, we just want to tell you about ACMG's mission. Like, the general mission of the college is to improve health through the practice of medical genetics, as well as through education and clinical research, and to guide the safe and effective integration of genetics and genomic into all of medicine and healthcare, resulting in improved personal and public health. And here I really want to, I'm underlying personal, because this comes to a debate that has been ongoing for a while regarding the uses of race, ethnicity, and ancestry in clinical genetics and the impact that this research can have. So as a group, we have an opinion regarding the use of these three terms. And we just want to say that as a historical concept, race is a challenging term to use in medical genetics. It is a construct based on social, political, and economic meanings, and that has changed definitions throughout the years. So racial identity can shift not only throughout generations, but also through a person's life. And therefore, it makes it an imprecise and sometimes unreliable terms to use in scientific studies. So, and especially for those individuals who consider themselves multiracial, however, they would lean towards one or other self-identity classification. and that biases and underpowers scientific conclusions. And lastly, let's not forget the genocide, the criminalization, the slavery, and the social division that the racial terminology and beliefs have generated through history, not only in the United States, but worldwide. So while some may argue that ethnicity is a better term to use, it is not, because it is not directly tied to racism. In the United States, this term has been used to bucket populations that do not neatly fit a racial classification, in particular Latin American populations. And I can tell you that because I was born in Mexico. So whenever I have to choose a racial denomination, I'm usually confused because it doesn't really fit anything from my background. And Latin American populations would be considered the prime example of multiracial ancestry with Native American, African, European, Asian population admixtures. So instead of analyzing this genetic richness, we just reduce it to a Latino population. So overall, our preference for the use of clinical genetics is to actually use genetic ancestry, because this can be directly inferred through individual genomic analysis, and it has the advantage of being more quantitative and increasing the power of variant interpretation analysis that utilizes the appropriate population for individuals, and also advances our understanding of potential gene-gene interactions, as well as the pathogenicity in different populations. And this truly delivers the promise of personalized medicine. So invariably, there are going to be challenges tied to this preference, as not all genomic texts would be able to provide a genome-wide information, particularly when you're like performing small panels or single gene analysis, or perhaps there's a population undersampling and it's not well represented in databases, thus limiting the use of population-specific interpretations. And finally, let's not forget that this also poses conflicts with an individual self-reported ancestry. You could have a conflict there, which may have unnecessary psychological impact on their well-being. So in cases where scientists want to incorporate population ancestry data but are unable to do so due to the nature of the genetic tests, inclusive population terms should be selected in these studies, and they should be specific enough to be used as proxies to actual genetic ancestry without falling into these racial color denominations, and also these terms should not negatively impact or further increase the rifts between these racial social constructs. So it is a discussion that is ongoing in our committee, and we would like to hear back from you. And like, while we understand that this may be a difficult conversation for some, we really need to take that initial step and to basically spark meaningful social change and to address that disturbing resilience of scientific racism. So once again, after all, a lot of different flowers make a bouquet, and it is our job as medical professionals to ensure the well-being of the whole bouquet, not just a few flowers. So with this, this concludes our presentation, and we're happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much for that really wonderful and comprehensive presentation. We do have one question from attendees in the chat, and now we have two. The first is, how do you know how diverse the ACMG membership is? Are you surveying the membership?
How do we know? What was it?
Do we have a measurement of how diverse the ACMG membership is?
Yeah, how do you know how diverse the membership is, and are you surveying members?
We have an idea through the counts that the American Board of Medical Genetics takes. We don't ask that question in our surveys. We would like to develop a survey for our members that is more than the typical white, Black, African, Hispanic. You know, we've had a conversation with you, Alice, about what the many selections should be, and even having a free text field for people to enter their answers. And that's what we would like to work towards, but we don't have anything that allows us to look and get an accurate assessment. We have an idea that we have about 4% Black or African, less than 10% Hispanic, and about 12%, I think, Asian, and the rest white. So that is the
Yeah,
makeup
that's
of our-
roughly consistent with our estimates as well from the survey we did of clinical genomics professionals and researchers a couple of years ago. We got about 80% white European participants.
So we're
So
hoping
that's our
if
current estimate.
we reach college students and teach them about genetics, and even at, at these meetings that we attended last fall, they're also having virtual meetings this year. But I'm hoping if we can develop something to keep their attention, like maybe spooling through 2-minute videos where people talk about their careers in genetics instead of waiting for them to come forward and ask a question, or we have some kind of swag that we can give out that, says, look at our website and talk about genetics or something. It'll be easier to do in person, obviously, than at their virtual meetings.
Yeah. So that's a good segue to the next question. And I know you have to go now, but maybe just with this last one. Do you have plans for outreach and support to underrepresented populations who aren't part of the current genetic workforce that could be? You mentioned briefly reaching out to high schools. Are there other plans in the works?
Well, actually at 2:00 we have our DEI meeting, and we are going to discuss that. What are we going to work towards, and how are we going to reach undergraduate students? We have plans to reach out to medical students from historically Black universities and colleges, and graduate students, but we want to reach out to undergraduates and even high school students to let them know about careers in genetics. But
Wonderful.
If anybody has any ideas, we are open.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for being with us, and I look forward to being in touch as we work together towards the development of recommendations and guidelines for race, ethnicity, ancestry, and clinical genetics. And for those on the call, we actually have an official liaison from the Acmg DEI committee to the Ancestry and Diversity Working Group of ClinGen. So we're going to maintain our close collaboration and conversation as we go forward. So we're doing this in partnership and not in parallel.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
I'm really excited to work with you. And thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
On to our next meeting. Bye.
Bye. So we have about 5 minutes left for discussion with the audience and with the other panelists. If you have questions or suggestions for the plans for ClinGen DEI efforts, our action plan, or any of the individual grants, I'd love to take questions or comments now. Or maybe I'll ask a prompt of the audience. If you could, of the action items we discussed today, what do you feel like is the most important? Could you put it in the Q&A for us, just as a comment? What do you feel like is the most important thing that, as members of the ClinGen community, that you'd really like us to see prioritized first and foremost? It's all important, but.
Alice, there's a couple of questions in the chat. So one would be about genetics professionals that are in other countries that are not ACMG certified. And then the second was, really just how to get involved in some of these groups.
Yeah, so involvement in the Ancestry and Diversity Working Group, we welcome people who feel like they really have some great project ideas of things that you would like to accomplish, evidence-based projects that we can sort of use to guide the development of recommendations. Again, the forum is open to everyone. So in terms of involvement, there are many different ways. You can also email me directly if you're not sure, but if you go to the Ancestry and Diversity Working Group webpage and navigate to the forum, there's a join the forum button, and then you can learn about how to do that. And then again, you can just email me directly if you are interested in joining the working group. And Danielle, it looks like you're on. Do you
Yes,
have?
I would just add, we do have a volunteer training program. So that is available. There was a link in the chat, I believe it's clinicalgenome.org/volunteer, run by our community curation working group. And there are opportunities for people interested in genetics, for students, or for professionals who would like to serve on our working groups or expert panels. It does involve training and going through the training protocols that we've set up. But the biggest barrier for people outside the US may be time zones in meetings, but there are opportunities for people at many different levels. So I encourage you to go to clinicalgenome.org/volunteer and learn about some of the opportunities we have there as well.
Awesome, thank you. Other questions or comments or suggestions? This is really our opportunity to hear from you about what your perspective is and your ideas. Obviously, you can follow up with us, but it'd be great to hear from you now. Okay. Well, it looks like we just have the volunteer link put in the chat so everyone can access it. I will also add my email address if anyone wants to get involved. And I will respond to your questions here in a moment. I'm going to turn it over to Meredith, who is going to introduce our last speaker and close us out for the day.
Yes, thanks, Alice. I have the pleasure of introducing the very, very, very last speaker for the retreat. And, and she has her camera on, great. So Erin Riggs is gonna give some closing remarks. So thank you, Erin.
No problem, and I apologize in advance. I do have some background noise, but if it gets too bad, Meredith will cut me off and take over. So let me share the screen. Just provide a few closing remarks. Again, thank you so much for attending our inaugural retreat. This is something that we are thinking of doing perhaps in the years that the CCG meeting is in Hingston, just as an opportunity for us to get together as the ClinGen community. So please, tell us your thoughts on that. We will be sending out a feedback questionnaire sometime next week, and that will be one of the questions. Would you come to this again? And if so, how frequently, and what would be the setup you would prefer? So keep an eye out for that, and please fill it out when it comes your way. I have personally really enjoyed my time at this retreat. I thought it was a really neat way for individuals across our various different working groups, expert panels, curation teams, etc., to virtually meet each other and to interact with each other in ways that we are often not able to do when we're just on our, maybe 1 hour work focused calls. So I thought that it was very helpful. Just an overview of some of the numbers. So we did have about 230 people participating in the very first breakout sessions yesterday. About 170 people in the main session yesterday, and then 134 in the evening. And then this morning we had about 156 people across the 3 different breakouts and approximately 160 people in this session. Again, be on the lookout for that feedback survey when it comes your way. I thought it would be important to just highlight a few of the housekeeping slides that you might have seen if you joined any of the sessions early, but in case you didn't, I'll just let you know of a few upcoming events. The first, we've mentioned this a couple of times today, but we will be hosting a clinical genomics career panel. This is going to actually begin next week. If you know anyone who might be interested in something like this, any students in your life, high school students, college students, what have you, please let them know about this. We have a URL where they can register and learn more at the bottom of this screen. Again, it starts next week. We'll be highlighting various different careers in medical genetics. All sessions will be recorded so that people in other time zones will be able to access it as well. Additionally, on a monthly basis, we have the ClinGen somatic cancer and VIC Virtual Molecular Tumor Case Board Series sponsored by ACMG. The next session is going to be on Tuesday, June 29th. So if you are interested in that, there is a URL here in which to register for that. Another thing I'd like to point out is that we do offer continuing educational credits for our gene curation volunteers, with plans to make this available to the volunteers in other curation activities in the future. But for now, we have credits available for gene curation. So if you are interested in pursuing those credits, please visit clinicalgenome.org/gene module to learn more. Someone was just asking this in the last session, so I will reiterate. If you are not yet a volunteer with ClinGen, or if you're considering referring any of your colleagues to join ClinGen after this retreat, here's how you can do it. That URL on the screen goes to a survey in which you can tell us a little bit about yourself and your interests, and then we will help get you trained and placed with an appropriate group. And then finally, I would just like to give a great thank you to all of the members of the planning committee. They have worked very hard to bring this event to you. And again, this is the first time that we're doing this. So it was a bit of a learning curve, but great thanks to everyone who helped put this event together. And thank you from ClinGen. Have a great weekend, everyone.